Tonight, he's going to talk to us about blind spots and bad decisions, why we fall for financial traps. Raghavendra.
Very much. So, thank you all for sparing the time on a Monday evening to come and listen to a talk on this. This is the third year in my series of talks here at Gresham College, and it's actually my last year. So this is my second last lecture. The last lecture is 2 weeks from now on the 16th of June, where I talk about the opposite side of this, that how do you use our blind spots to try to actually survive in a world where, there are traps everywhere. But that's for 2 weeks from now. Today, we just introduce this topic here. So in my 3 years here, in the first year, I talked about how technology is changing the world of finance. In the second year, I talked about what are the building blocks, the foundations of modern finance. And they said there are only 6 ideas, and each lecture covered one of those 6 ideas. But the interesting part about those 6 ideas, of course, is it assumes that the people who are in the financial industry are rational computing machines who know exactly how to calculate probabilities, who know how to update probabilities, who know to calculate present values, basically people we are not, right? And so in this year's series of lectures, I've been exploring the human side of finance. And the first part of the 4 lectures so far have been about agency problems and asymmetric information. The idea is financial institutions know more than you do, and so they can use that additional information to try to take advantage of you. So each lecture has been devoted to a different part of that industry, including mutual funds, insurance companies, and so on. But that's not the end of the story. So today's lecture, I'm going to talk about why do smart people actually fall for these financial choices, which are being presented by these financial intermediaries. And the essence of today's lecture is about to say, even if our information was perfect, we would still get it wrong. Right? And in many ways, the problem isn't always the market. It's us, that we have a set of rules which we follow instinctively without even knowing that we follow these rules. Now, by the way, Richard mentioned a few minutes ago to use your phones to ask questions, but I'm also going to use your phones to make you vote on particular problems which I'll put up in front of you. So please have your phones ready. I'll have a QR code, and you can use the QR code to vote accordingly, all right? But not right away. I'll do it in a couple of minutes. But these are the 2 worlds of finance. The first world of finance is basically classical finance, which is what I was talking about the whole of last year. The idea here is we are rational agents. We use things like Bayes' rule to update probabilities. We use things like calculating expected utility to get to the best possible decision we can get to. And of course, we have behavioral finance, which is emotional people. We anchor on irrelevant information, available information. We hate losses. We reframe stuff to make ourselves feel better. Basically, human beings, right? So let's ask ourselves, starting a question, right? Are we actually rational, the way finance assumes us to be, right? So I'm going to start with the first question, right? I assume all of you have had lunch today, right? You're eating by yourself. When do you stop eating? Excellent. See the 2 dominant answers here are when my plate is empty or when I'm no longer hungry. These are the obvious responses, right? And these are rational responses, but both of them are very interesting choices. Why? Well, let me introduce you to something called the Bottomless bowl. And this was an actual study done where basically the researcher took a bowl of soup and he served it to different people, but Some of the bowls basically had a tube running below the table into a massive bowl of soup right there, which you see on the top left-hand corner. So what would happen is, as you're drinking the soup, it keeps getting mysteriously refilled. It's a dark soup, so you can't really see that it's getting refilled. So the question he was trying to ask is, when do people stop eating? It turned out the people with the bottomless bowl actually drank 74% more soup than the people who didn't have the bottomless bowl. But more interestingly, they had absolutely no idea they'd actually drunk more soup than the day before. Right? It was like, we asked them, how much more did you drink? Like, pretty much what I always do. So, in fact, this is a whole science of how to eat less. For example, the environmental cues, right? If it turns out you have large plate sizes, people serve and eat more when your plates are larger. So, if you want to eat less, use a smaller bowl, use a smaller plate. If you have a taller, narrower glass, people pour less into those because they're looking at the height of the water, not the amount of water. If you increase the contrast, that means if there's less contrast, people don't actually see how much they're eating, they eat more. Highly contrasting food, people tend to eat less because they can see differences, visual differences in the color. So, those stories about eating the rainbow, that's why you want to eat the rainbow. Not necessarily because it is good for you, but it's also because you eat less. And there are lots of other things. For example, people eat less when portions are pre-served. You eat more when food is in arm reach. You eat more when you're watching TV. All the stuff on mindful eating and all that stuff is all based in how people actually behave. Anyway, let me ask you a different question, right? Would you give yourself an electric shock on purpose? So let me ask you that question. So you're strapped with an electric shock bracelet and a button to administer the shock, right? The question is, you would give yourself an electric shock. If someone offered to give me an electric shock, I would say no, and I would pay someone not to give me an electric shock. Somebody here is very brave. These are exactly the answers in a study which was also done. And the study was published in Nature. I'll show you what the study looks like. So what happened in this particular study was, it turns out that we need stimulation, all of us, all the time. If you're by yourself even 1 second, what do? Automatically reach for our phones. And we start scrolling, we start doing whatever, right? We have lost that ability to live without constant stimulation. So in this particular situation, this was the University of Virginia, what they did was they basically gave these guys boring tasks, and then they sat them down in a room with absolutely no stimulation. Empty room, they're just left there to sit, looking at blank walls or whatever. They were also strapped. They could push a button and shock themselves if they wanted to. It was just their entire choice, their choice. Turns out that 2/3 of the men and 25% of the women, men are dumber than women, what can we say? Right? 2/3 of the men chose to give themselves an electric shock rather than just sit quietly and think. Right? We can't do this. But the finance basically says people are not like this. People behave rationally. People will not try this kind of behavior. So this is all a question of beliefs and preferences, right? Sometimes we make mistakes in our beliefs. For example, we don't apply Bayes' law properly, and I'll give you examples of that in a few minutes. Sometimes we will also, the beliefs are okay, but then we make weird choices, because if those were your beliefs, no rational person would have actually made that decision, but we do. So I'll give you examples of that as well. Those are called subjective expected utility. We choose decisions which maximize the amount of utility we get, but in reality, we don't. So how exactly do people misapply Bayes' law, or how exactly do they deviate from subjective expected utility? Well, there are two types of biases. Number one are what we call belief biases. That's the first question. What mistakes do we make in our beliefs? And there are lots of these biases: overconfidence, optimism, representativeness, availability, anchoring, confirmation, local representativeness, things like that. There's another one called preference biases, which is we know our beliefs, the beliefs are updated rationally, but then we make mistakes in trying to figure out how to apply them to choose a particular thing. So reference points, loss aversion, calculation of probabilities, prospect theory, things like that. Both affect financial decisions, and interestingly, they're predictable. That means they make us easier to manipulate. So let's step back and say, what are we really like as human beings? Right? There is a TV series which some of you may have seen, and it was on ABC a long time ago, maybe around the turn of the century. It was called Cavemen. And it was about a group of cave people who were discovered in this remote place in America, and they're brought to New York, and they end up like that, right? So they're absolutely no idea how to deal with the modern world. And the whole point, the comedy was about how difficult these people had in responding to the normal world. The problem, of course, when I saw that series, is very funny. But when I saw that series, I said, really, internally, we are all like this. We may look better and possibly have better teeth, but we are essentially, at our core, still cave people, because we had several million years of evolution being instinctively reacting to situations. We've only had 200 years of dealing with modern financial markets. So that is the major issue. Let's take an example, right? How we evolved. For example, a lot of you have probably been to Stonehenge, right? So what did you think when you first saw Stonehenge? When you first time in your life, you went in there and you're like, wow, this is the most amazing thing I've seen? What did you think?
Like disillusioned, like this is not all that.
Yeah, exactly. Right? A lot of people have exactly that reaction. Bunch of stones, big deal. The interesting part about this is not just a bunch of stones, right? Because the people who constructed Stonehenge actually got the rocks from Wales. They're not available in that area. So you had to bring them 600 miles on rollers because you didn't have wagons big enough to carry those stones. They weigh several tons. Ship them across the sea, then drag them up rollers, bring them to Stonehenge. But why would they do something like that? Well, think about what it was when living in those times, right? There are no clocks. There are no watches. There are no phones. There's nothing to tell you what time is. You have no idea what the calendar is. But yet, you need a calendar. You need to know when to sow your crops. You need to know when to harvest the crops. You need to know when to hunt the animals. You need to know the migratory pattern of the animal. So how do you know that? Well, maybe word of mouth, right? You ask your dad says, oh yeah, when the red star rises above that tree over there, that's about the time you want to sow the crops. Then your dad dies, and you're like, which tree was he talking about? I wasn't paying attention. I wish I paid more attention to him, right? Maybe that tree, maybe when someone cuts down the tree, right? Then you're dumb. So what these guys did was actually interesting, because Stonehenge was not right away put up in the place it was now. They moved those rocks around for 600 years from place to place until you find a place where you know the sun rises between the lintel stones on the equinox. That's the beginning of spring. Except they didn't actually have a calendar which said, okay, that's the equinox day. It was trial and error. You're creating a clock without knowing that you're creating a clock. You have no idea what you're doing except trying to find a way of predicting patterns. That's what we evolved with. And unfortunately, what do we have to deal with? Well, this is a world with lots of changing information, but a world with predictable patterns. So we use a lot of shortcuts because those patterns keep repeating. The seasons keep repeating. We know what's happening, so we keep doing the same thing, which much faster because we know what the patterns are. However, though the patterns help in making sense of information, they're misapplied in two circumstances. Number one, when the phenomenon itself is completely random. Right? Examples? a stock market. Right? If people are reacting on the basis of information and prices are moving at random intervals, it's very difficult to predict where the price is. But we are very good at finding patterns even when there are none. The other example, casinos. If there's a predictable pattern in a casino, the casino will go bankrupt because people will grab that pattern and trade in the casino really fast. So unfortunately, we apply those pattern recognition habits we have to purely random phenomena. And that's one of the reasons why it looks like we're making bad decisions. It's just that we are applying a pattern recognition algorithm to an area where there is no pattern. So let's take an example. This was an article from the Financial Times. It was talking about Spotify's shuffle feature. And the story, if you can't read it, is by a reporter called Heather McCalden. And she says, in my case, in the evening of December 15, 2023, she was coming out coming out an apartment block. They're completely blitzed on champagne. The taxi appears right in front of her as she steps out. So she gets into the taxi and hits, shuffle on Spotify. And it comes up with a song called Maps, which was an indie rock love ballad which she hadn't heard in a long period of time. And then as she is listening to that song, she looks up and she sees her ex-husband's apartment right there with a light, only in that one light in that building. No other light. The building is completely dark except for that one light. And she's saying, oh my God, why did this taxi come here? Why did the taxi take a left turn? You could have gone, the right turn would have been easier. They took a left turn and the song came out right when I was looking at that. It can't be coincidence. There's a deep cosmic meaning here. Does that sound familiar? A lot of us look at this and say, oh yeah, that's, something we ascribe meanings to stuff. Right? Okay, so let's do another example here. Okay. Now you can see from this graph what I'm trying to get at, right? The graph is what we call right skewed. What that basically means is the average, by the way, should be right there in the middle. And a lot of people have indeed chosen the average. But if you look at the average of the distribution, most people will be over here. You cannot have a distribution where the average is above average. Right? And that's exactly what most people are. We tend to be basically a little overconfident about our own abilities, right? This is a very, very normal thing. So, coming back in here, the first one is overconfidence. A lot of people say, you know what, markets may be tough, but I'm smarter than the market. And most people think they're above average. Fair enough. Now, let's go to a different question. Right? You all have your own peers at work, at school, or whatever. Rank yourself relative to peers in the amount of praise you get from your boss, your teacher, or whatever in the next few years. Right? Relative to your peers, you know your peers, what do you think? How do you rank yourself relative to them? Okay. Also extremely normal, but let me finish another question before we get to this. Third one, rank yourself relative to the same peers in terms of the number of accidents you're going to have in the next 5 years. You know your peers, right? So relative to them, what do you think? This is called the optimism bias, right? And it's also a fundamental part of us as human beings. Most people think that bad stuff will happen to other people, but good stuff will happen to us, right? And this makes perfect evolutionary sense. If we think all the time that bad stuff is happening to me while good stuff is happening to other people, you're probably not going to survive very long, right? You're depressed, you definitely don't have kids, your genes are never going to get passed on to the next generation. But most people are super optimistic. They think, bad stuff, not for me, somebody else, right? Good stuff for me. That's how we wake up in the morning. You're like, yes, I'm going out there. And then, bad stuff happens, but only temporarily. Good stuff happens to us all the time. Okay, and unfortunately, shows up in the financial markets too. You're overconfident and over-optimistic traders, and they typically earn lower returns. Men trade more. They tend to be more overconfident and over-optimistic than women, and they earn less. Right? So if your mutual fund manager is a man, please change him immediately. Go with a woman as your mutual fund manager. Right? And the trading volume, and the more these people trade, the worse they do. And that's, again, because they get hit with trading commissions and things like that. Okay. Unfortunately, forecasting the future is super difficult. Right? Let me give you an example. Right? How do we estimate what is likely to happen? So, for example, suppose we see this when you're driving. You see, this is America, so you see a traffic policeman basically stop a car right in front of you and you're driving. What do you do? That is by far the most common answer. Nearly everybody slows down. Now, why is that, right? Well, the answer is because most of us are not consciously thinking of these things when we are driving. We're driving along, listening to music, maybe arguing with our partner, whatever, right? You know how things go. Or your kids are bugging you, whatever. They're driving. Right? And then suddenly you see a cop. It has not been there on top of your brain right then, but now it's suddenly at the top of your brain. So immediately say, shit. Everybody, doesn't matter who you are, you will check your speedometer. Right? And then you slow down, even if you're at the right speed. It's like, it's brought to the top of your attention. The key thing here is just happened to me, is availability. That's a big part about forecasting what's happening to you, right? It's available, that means it raises the probability with which you believe that this thing is going to happen. Second, let me give you another bunch of questions. So, what is a more likely cause of death in the US? Blood poisoning or homicide? Okay, let me ask you two more questions. Next one, again, what's a more likely cause of death in the US? Vending machine accidents or shark attacks? Okay, and final question. What's a more likely cause of death in the US, heat or tornadoes? Okay, excellent. So you guys are right, by the way. The average is correct. So blood poisoning is way more common than homicide, but a significant number of people thought of homicide simply because of the fact it's reported in all the papers every day. Sepsis is way more common, but is not reported in the papers. It goes back to the availability question. If you don't read about it, it happens, but it's not news, so it biases our recall. Similarly, there turns out 350,000 people died of sepsis every year, 24,000 people were shot to death. Right? So that's too high, but still much less than sepsis. Right? Again, another thing is I can easily imagine that happening. That's the idea with media effects availability. Right? Shock attacks, for example, are not common at all, but the newspapers report this all the time. So if you think about shock attacks, there are even movies made about this, right? We have, for example, Jaws. You have movies made about sharks and tornadoes. Sharknado, if you guys have seen it, Sharknado 1, 2, 3, 4. By the way, I've just given away the plot line, so don't need to see the movie if you haven't seen it, right? The sharks and tornadoes, right? Okay, let me ask you yet another question now. Right? And this one basically says, I'm now, right now, thinking of a 7-letter word. What is the probability that the 6th letter, only the 6th letter, is N? Is it high probability or low probability? Just the 6th letter. Okay. Excellent. Reasonably low probability. Fair enough. My word is very complicated. But let me ask you a different question. Right? I'm thinking of a different 7-letter word. What is the probability that the word ends in ing? Okay. Well, if you think about it, these two questions are exactly the same, right? One 6, 7-letter word, 6-letter ends in N, can be a 4-letter word where the last 3 letters are ing and then add ing, right? Walking, talking, rocking, a whole bunch of them you can think of right away. This is again what we call availability. If it's available to us, we can immediately estimate the probabilities and we rank it too high. Right? Okay, so if you think of examples easily, we think, oh, this is really common. This is something which is normal. This is something which is we can understand immediately. Let's go to a different question here, right? Now, let's suppose we read about a guy called Steve. Steve is very shy and withdrawn. He's very helpful, but he has little interest in people or the world of reality. He's a meek and tidy soul. He has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. Okay? So what do you think Steve's job is? There are several options for you. He could be, any of these. Here's the description again. Right? Okay. This, by the way, is an example of, in a way, stereotyping, but what we call the conjunction fallacy. Why? It's because if you think of the number of accountants who are not office workers, very, very few, right? All accountants almost all, are office workers. But there are lots of office workers who are not accountants. So by sheer just picking a number out of a hat, he's much, much more likely to be an office worker than an accountant. Right? Few accountants, every accountant is an office worker, but there are lots of office workers who are not accountants. But this one here is my favorite. Turns out that number surges. I'll tell you why in a second. But what's happening here is we're looking at what we call stereotypes. If you talk about superheroes, for example, there are only 3 characteristics all superheroes have. They wear their underwear on the outside, they have tragically dead parents, and they have a cape. Right? So any of the Marvel movies, this is what you see. And there are lots of examples, right? You see Superman, Magneto, Dr. Fate, Batman, Robin, they all have all 3. Otherwise, you have 2 or 3. But we immediately can look at a movie and say, okay, that's a superhero, because you're just focusing on stereotypes. But anyway, coming back in here, let's look at this question here. Right? This story we're telling ourselves, the shortcuts we take about the world, depend on what these stereotypes are. Right? We don't need to do too much work if you can just read that. Okay? So in this particular case, this description screams accountant. Right? It's so powerful that people will dominantly vote for accountant. But as I said, the probabilities don't support it, right? Lots of office workers, very few accountant. Now, but there is one curious answer, which I love, this one over here. A lot of people are actually saying, mixed martial art fighter. Well, how does that come about? Well, it turns out the answer to that question surges after the release of the Ben Affleck movie, The Accountant, and now The Accountant 2, where now you have an accountant who is not an office worker, who is an office worker, he works in an office, but he's also a mixed martial artist. Right? You're like, whoa, this guy is so powerful, right? You watch that movie and you come out like, okay, every accountant, every office worker is an accountant who is in turn an expert at killing people. That's a big example of the conjunction fallacy, right? You're expecting 2 things together to be more likely than one of them alone. Okay. So that means because we keep looking for these patterns, we keep expecting. It happened before, it's going to happen again, right? So if you have a recent crash, we get worried. And if you have recent wins, we think you fear of missing out. And so we keep jumping back into the market when we see the market rising. Okay, so example, crypto. Right? So crypto went up. Everybody invested in crypto. 2017, crypto crashed. Everybody got out of crypto. Crypto's back up again. So you keep seeing that cycle keep coming up again and again. All right, let's take another example of the conjunction fallacy. This is happening a lot around the world with the ease of sports betting. So these are what we call long-shot sports bets. So in this particular case, this football fan, Alex Haberkern, decided to make 14 different predictions on how the NFL player's performance would be, including touchdowns and so on and so forth. She used $10 to place the bet, and if she won, she would win $22,000. Well, unfortunately, it turns out of the 14 predictions, 13 predictions actually came true. The 14th didn't, so she lost her $10. But in particular, if you pay just a simple one, which just says, I put in this case here, that Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift's boyfriend, will score the first touchdown. That has a 13% chance of happening. Payout isn't very big. But if you go with all these things, the probability is less than 0.19%. But the payout is 5,156. So a significant number of people put in bets like this because they think the probability of all these happening is higher than it actually is. Right? That's why the payout is so high, because it's not going to happen. Okay, so anyway, this has happened. The payout was 0. The probability, of course, was 0. That actually happened on Wall Street as well. So in 2008, there was somebody called, in this particular case, David Lee. David Lee was considered a genius because he had figured out a way to use a complicated mathematical model called a copula model to try to determine how different events were correlated. So the idea was, if I know that something is going to happen, if I figure out something is going to happen, I know the other things that can happen with it as well. So you use that to make a lot of money. And people thought, my God, this guy was probably going to get a Nobel Prize, until, of course, 2008 happened, right? He got fired, and he naturally never made us any money. His company lost a ton of money. So anyway, he basically depended on past correlations to predict the future, and it didn't work. Third possibility, another possibility, is what we call anchoring. Right? So, for example, a simple question might be, Attila the Hun invaded Europe and penetrated deep into what is now France when they're defeated and forced to return eastward. In what year did these events occur? Now, the average person, without using Wikipedia or the web, has no idea of the answer to this question. Right? I'm not going to ask you guys, by the way. Okay? But interestingly, if you change the question a little bit, you ask a different question first. What are the last 3 digits of your phone number? Right? Think about it. And then add 400 to that number. Okay, everybody? All right. Then you ask the same question. Attila the Hun invaded Europe, defeated in France, forced to return eastward. When did that happen? There should be absolutely no correlation between question 1 and question 2. It turns out there is. The correlation is about 0.75, which means essentially that for every year, every digit that your phone number goes up by 4 digits, Attila the Hun is defeated 3 years later. The key part here is, again, we've asked for a number. The brain is looking for a number. So I've given you a number, the 400 plus the last 3 digit number. So we anchor on that number, and we fail to adjust up or down when that thing happens. So this has been shown in a lot of cases. For example, in MBA students at MIT were asked whether they're going to buy a number of items for an amount equal to the last 2 digits of the Social Security numbers. Right? And they were asked the willingness to pay for those things. There should be absolutely no relation between the last 2 digits of the Social Security number and the amount you're willing to pay for something completely different. Turns out there was. If your Social Security number was a high digit, so it was like 98, it would pay a lot more for a cordless trackball, cordless keyboard, an average wine, a rare wine, design book, or Belgian chocolates. If your Social Security number is really low, like 01, you wouldn't pay that much money for it. And we see this pattern all the time. So for example, you're shown a moderately upscale restaurant named either Studio 17 or Studio 97. They asked how much they're willing to pay. The first group was willing to pay $25. Second group was willing to pay $28. It's a number, right? But it seems to affect our choices. In another study, estimates of the athlete's performance were influenced by the number on his jersey. The higher the number on your jersey, better people thought you would be in the game. Or the proportion of sales in the domestic market were influenced by the product model number. Higher model numbers, they expected higher sales. And this was given by financial analysts. Okay, and smart marketers exploit the anchoring. We've all heard of this thing, numbers ending in 9, right? So you see 9.99. Why? We all know that it shouldn't work, right? 9.99 and 10 are pretty similar. Right? The interesting part is it works because we start from the left. So when we're looking at a number, we start with 2.99. We don't start with 99 first and then the 2. So you have a choice of 2.99 or 3.01. You're comparing the 2 and the 3, which appears a lot larger than it actually is. It's a 2-cent difference, but we think of it as much larger than that. So we are comparing. We think a drop from 4.01 to 3 is less than a drop from 4 to 2.99. The difference is exactly the same. Right? 4 to 2 seems bigger than 4 to 3. Right? We're starting thinking again from the left. So these are irrelevant numbers. In China, for example, the number 4 sounds like death. So no company goes public at 4.44. Right? They go public at 8.88 because the number 8 in Chinese ba sounds like fa, which means luck, good luck, fortune, and so on. So absolutely no relevance, but it has a powerful effect on what happened there. And we focus on certain numbers. For example, you buy it at a particular number, that's the number you're fixated on. When you make a loss, and the price goes below 50, a lot of us will keep waiting for the price to come back up before we sell it. Right? It's like We're reluctant to take losses in this particular case. And those anchors distort our judgment, even when we know better. So let's take another test. This is a rule which says you have to test this rule. If a card shows an even number on one face, the opposite face is blue. All right? That's the rule I'm asking you to test. So you have to turn over a minimum number of cards to prove that this rule is correct. Okay? So which numbers would you turn over? The card shows an even number on one face. The opposite face is blue. This is a complicated question. The most common answer is exactly the answer up here, right? Number 8 and the blue card. And that first one makes perfect sense. You're turning over the number 8, check the opposite side. If it is blue, fine, right? You got the thing. If it is red, you know that the rule is not true. But the interesting part is the second card. The dominant answer here is blue, right? You turn over the blue and check what the number is on the other side. But if it has an even number on the other side, you've just confirmed what the first number has already told you. You confirmed this one already. What you should be doing is looking for evidence that disconfirms what you're doing. So the right answer is turn over the 8, check whether there's blue on the other side, but turn over the red and see whether there's an even number on that side. If there is, the rule is disproved. But most of us are terrible at looking for evidence that disconfirms our biases. We want evidence that confirms what we are already thinking about, right? So coming back in here, this is called confirmation bias, right? We're looking for what we want to believe. So if bad news arrives, we say, okay, we don't really like this news, so we're not going to think about it, right? If good news arrives, we focus on that. If the evidence supports what we already believe, we overweight it. If it disproves what we believe, we try to underweight it. And unfortunately, our world is getting smaller because most of us use social media like crazy, right? And in our social media, our friends are basically echoing what we see already. So we have these algorithmic echo chambers. We never see opposing side views. Everybody we talk to has exactly the same view we have. Those are the things which are being shot up by the social media algorithms. And so we believe everybody in the world is like us. People who are not like us are few and far between, and definitely weirdos whom we don't want to be hanging out with, right? It's much worse in America than here, but hey, what can you do? So, but let me go back to explaining the same test from a different perspective, right? So in this particular example, I'm going to give you a variation. The question is, who do you ask for proof of age? The rule is, if you're drinking alcohol, you must be over 18. So you have to ask for proof of age from one or more of these people. One person is 16 years old, one person is 25, one person is drinking a can of soda, the last one is drinking a mug of beer. So who do you ask for proof of age? Interestingly, this is the same test, right? But now, the answers are all correct, almost all. This is the correct one, obviously, the 13, 16-year-old, right? And the beer drinker. So essentially, you're looking for a situation here which is exactly similar to our previous situation. We're looking for disconfirming evidence here. But why are we doing it here but not in the previous example? The previous example is a logical example. It's completely contrary to how we think. This is a social example. So we're looking at the same question, but now we're looking at it from the point of view of social situations. How do people behave? And that's much easier to be intuitive about because we have done this for thousands of years, right? Culture is about understanding how other people think. The worsen test, as it's originally formulated, is a pure logic problem. Nobody understands logic, right? We're terrible at this, we're terrible at finance, and so that's the problem we have over there. So that's the first set of biases, the belief biases. But there's also a second set of biases, the preference biases. So let's take some examples of these as well, right? First thing is reference points. We are very bad with absolute numbers. We focus on relative numbers. Let's take a couple of examples of that as well. So the first question, I'm coming back to this question. The first question is, you're considering buying a 4K curved screen TV at Bang & Olufsen, costs you £3,499. You already talked to the salesman, listened to the TV in a special soundproof room, you're convinced this is the TV for you. And as you're getting out to pay for the TV, your friend calls you and tells you the Argos is selling the exact same TV for $3,479 across town. But it's going to take you 15 extra minutes to drive to Argos to buy the TV there. The question is, where do you buy the TV? Excellent. Now, let's flip the question a little bit. Let's suppose you're standing in Tesco buying a set of low wattage LED bulbs, 59 pounds. You hear that Aldi is selling the exact same set for 39 pounds across town. It's going to take you 15 extra minutes to buy the bulb from Aldi. Where would you choose to buy these bulbs? Again, not very surprising, right? We're terrible at numbers. So 20 pounds is the difference in both the cases. But the key part is 20 pounds in an absolute sense means very little. On a relative sense, it makes sense, right? So in the first case, 20 pounds on 3,499, that's a rounding error. But 20 pounds on a 59 pounds, that's 1/3 off, right? So the same question, the same 20 pounds, but we have very different answers because we're very, very good at relative numbers. We're terrible at absolute numbers. Or let me ask you a different question. You're considering, and by the way, what I'm trying to say is this can easily be taken advantage of. So let's take an example. You're considering getting a 1-year subscription to New York Times, and you have a choice of 2 things. Unlimited online access, $49, or daily newspaper and home delivery with unlimited online access for $109. Okay? So where do you choose to get a subscription? The unlimited online access or the other one, the daily home delivery and unlimited online access? Excellent, right? This is a standard answer. But that's not the example I'm focusing on. The example I'm focusing on is a real example which was used by The Economist. You're considering getting a 1-year subscription to The Economist, and you have 3 options. Option one is get online only, $30, print edition only, $70, or print edition and the website for $30. it's obvious in this case that nobody picks the print edition only. Right? So why did the economists even offer this? Well, let's go back and take a look at the actual thing. Right? So this was an actual ad. So this is the numbers I've taken from The Economist. So why did The Economist give that? Well, it turns out that the key part is this is all introductory offers. But after the introductory offer, if they only offered those two choices, print and digital loan, which was like the New York Times, they got a total revenue of 8012 because most students would go with digital only, exactly like all of you. But when they offered the Decoy, which is a subscription price of 125, print and digital 425, or digital only for 59, everybody went with the middle one. 84 students went for that. And they get considerably higher prices because nobody turns off The Economist after the introductory subscription. Right? So you just stay with 6 weeks, you pay this, and then the price jumps up. But you don't shift away. So these decoy effects are everywhere. Right? Irrelevant choices which force you to take a particular choice, kind of like a magician making you pick a card. Right? Here are some examples. You have a small popcorn for $3, a medium popcorn for 6.5, a large popcorn for 7. If you don't have the decoy in the middle, nobody picks a large, they half and half pick it. But if you have the decoy, everybody goes for the large because you're like only 50 cents more and it's double the size. Or if you think about in finance, you're trying to make people choose between two stocks. One has a high long-term growth but low dividend yield. The other has a high dividend yield but low growth. If you want them to pick A, what do? Well, give them a decoy. The decoy is right over there, which makes A look really good. Everybody goes for the A. Otherwise, you give them a different decoy, and everybody goes for the B. Whichever one gives you a higher, a higher commission, that's the one you go with, or has expense ratio. Third example is of mental accounting. Right? We account for things as different patterns in our brain. Right? Think about being paid a special bonus over your regular compensation. The bonus will be paid as part of your salary. You'll be paid monthly over the course of the year. Increase your take-home pay by £500 every month for the next 12 months. So what I'd like you to do is to tell me how much you expect your family's monthly consumption to increase during the next month. Okay? £500 paid every month for the rest of the year. Okay. And this is very normal. The average person spends about 40 to 50% of the bonus when you're part of your regular. Okay. But now, let's take a different question. The bonus will not be paid as part of your regular salary. It's paid in one lump sum at the end of the year, and you get nothing today. You get nothing next month. You get nothing till the end of the year. And then its value after tax is £6,000. The question is, how much you expect your family's monthly consumption to increase during the next month, the month where you get nothing at all? This is also extremely normal. And the interesting part, of course, is that when you get your bonus, you don't spend it on the things you would spend normally. If you get the £500 during every month, you spend it on more groceries, eating out more often, concerts, movies, whatever. But when you get the bonus at the end of the year, that's when you buy the big screen TV, new game station, whatever, right? You do not spend it on your day-to-day stuff. Final question. One of your distant relatives have died, left you with a small inheritance. After tax value of $6,000, you're not going to get the money for 5 years. At that time, it's held in a government bond fund. Invest in risk-free bonds. At the end of 5 years, you get $6,000 plus all the accumulated interest. Again, same question. How much do you expect your family's monthly consumption to increase during the next month? And this is, again, extremely normal, right? Most people, part of your regular bonus, that's when you spend it. If you spend it at the end, if you get an inheritance 5 years later, it goes into a different mental account in your brain. It's an inheritance account. You wouldn't touch that, right? And there's a capital spending account. So your £6,000 goes into a capital spending account. It's only the monthly bonus that goes into your regular monthly budget. Same pound, but you treat it differently depending on how the pound comes to you. So in real life, if you think about how people behave, they talk about bonuses, but you can change how people do this, right? So there's the same pound, but we're using different areas in our brain to account for this money, right? Or let's take a last example. New York City taxi drivers rent their cars for 12 hours on a fixed fee. You pay the same fee to the owner of the taxi, but you can keep all the money you make. The key decision is how long to work on a given day. Some days are busier than others. So on a busy day, you make lots of money, lots of profits. On a slow day, you don't make any money, but you still have to pay the same fixed fee to the owner of the cab. So when should you think a rational cab driver should work longer? A busy day or a slow day? And that makes perfect logical sense, right? Busy day, you make a lot of money and you use that to tide you over on the slow day. Unfortunately, New York taxi cab drivers do not behave like that. Their mental accounting is on a daily basis. So what they do is, if they make lots of money, they knock off and go home early. If they don't make much money, they keep cruising the streets looking for fares, right? That's why when you don't want a cab, they're everywhere. When you want a cab, you can never find one, right? Because they've knocked off and gone home early. Okay, so this is called a target income bias. You know what your target income is. You need to make a profit on that day. And so it leads to lost earnings here. Well, let's ask this question. You're watching a roulette wheel in a casino getting ready to play. The last 24 spins, 24, have resulted in a black number winning. You have to place a bet right now. You have two colors, black or red. What color should you bet on? 24 spins have landed on black. This is actually based on a real-life example, right, which actually did happen. In Monte Carlo in 1913, the ball fell on black 26 times in a row. So gamblers lost millions betting on red, believing that the chance is going to change. I mean, it landed on red 24 times, black 24 times. It must land on red. I mean, it's time for it to land on red. The key point is, this is purely random. But our mental thing says, on average, it should be 50% red, 50% black. It cannot have landed 24 times on black and then come up with black again on the 25th time, which it did, 26 times. So if you bet on black or red, right, in this particular case, you would have been better off betting on black. But, you know, this is a random phenomenon to which we're attributing known probabilities in the long run. So millions of roulette wheel things, on average, should be 50%. With 25, it's too small a number. You can have 25 blacks in a row. Okay. Last example, probability updating. You've been advised by your doctor to get tested for a rare but fatal form of cancer. If you have the cancer, the only way out is immediate treatment with high doses of chemotherapy and surgery. But these have severe side effects: hair loss, weight gain, muscle weakness. The cancer exists in only 1% of the population, but the test is 90% accurate. And you take the test comes back positive. So the question for you is, with that positive test, would you have the chemotherapy and surgery? If you do not have the chemotherapy and surgery, and you do have the cancer, you will die. Okay? And again, most people do exactly this. They have the chemotherapy and surgery. But this is what we call misapplication or probability updating. To give it a chance, the key part here is not that the cancer test is 90% accurate. The point is how often is that cancer exists, 1% of the population. If you have 1,000 people, 990 will not have the disease. Only 1%, 10 people will have the disease. The test is accurate 90% of the time. So 90% of them will test negative, right? But 10% of them will test positive when they do not have the cancer. That's 99 people. Simultaneously, the people with the disease have only 10, of which 90% will test positive, 1 will test negative. So what are the chances that the test will give you a positive result? Well, 9, and you actually have the cancer. The answer is 9 divided by 9 plus 99, which is 108 people. So you have of 108 people with a positive result, only 9 actually have the cancer. That's less than 10%. So a positive result does not mean anything unless you know the probability of the base event. And we have these problems all the time. For example, this was an article in the New York Times saying, what's the risk of arterial fibrillation? Having 1 small drink a day, 4 ounces of wine, 11 ounces of beer, 1.3 ounces of this, 16% increase relative risk for arterial fibrillation compared with abstaining. 16%. Wow, that's amazing. Except the number of people actually dying of arterial fibrillation is so small that, 16% increase, yeah, you're reducing your lifespan by 2 days. Okay, go and have the drink. Or you see other ones like this. Walking just 10 minutes a day may lead to a longer life. So examples here, they used, even a little extra activity could potentially stave off hundreds and thousands of premature deaths over the coming years. Question is, how many of these premature deaths were actually caused by lack of exercise? Very, very small. So yeah, walk 10 minutes a day, you're not going to increase your lifespan really very much. Stay in bed, have a drink. Well, not medical advice. Okay. Anyway, where it gets dangerous is the problem is they don't just cause mistakes, they leave us vulnerable to exploitation, right? We have misleading products, we have excessive fees, we have complex contracts. So the money doctors I talked about in my last lecture they know all these blind spots. For example, overconfidence. They will sell expensive product with high turnover, which means basically high expense ratios. What they call structured products, variable annuities, actively managed funds, because all of them give them high commissions. They will, for example, frame it. They call a structured note that's principal protected, means that you're going to get back your money. In many cases, you get back your money under a lot of cases, but there's specific situations when you lose all your money. Or they choose selected reporting periods of time when they really perform well, and that's part they'll display to you. They'll talk about loss aversion, right? They overload you with insurance products, extended warranties, for example. Or if you're losing an investment, losing money, they'll encourage you not to sell. So hold on, it will come back up. Mental accounting. If you have an income portfolio, they recommend dividend-paying stocks. Capital preservation, right, for a high-fee product for retirees. This takes into account all these biases which you have. So why don't we push back? Well, one is our self-image, right? Our self-serving biases, we're optimistic, we're overconfident, so we don't think we are capable of being tricked. Right? Other people might be, but we can see through these things. Similarly, we have conformity, right? Everyone's buying it. So, it seems to be a pretty popular product. I've seen it everywhere. Why not me? So there was a psychologist called Ash who ran a conformity test where he asked people to basically rate 3 lines to see where the middle line is longer than the other 2, right? 3 lines in a row. And what he did was to have 9 ringers along with a 10th guy who was the only person being studied. They would give the right answer. This line is longer, whatever. But every now and then, all the 9 people would agree on a wrong answer. They would say that line number 1 is longer than 2 or 3, when line number 1 is clearly shorter. The question is, what would the 10th person do? He's seen all these 9 people clearly voting for some line which is shorter and claiming it's longer. In 70% of the cases, that person would say, oh yeah, that's definitely longer. Right? They are unwilling to speak out. And they said, basically, everyone's doing it. It must be correct. Similarly, authority. The Milgram experiment consisted of people asking other people, people giving other people electric shocks for being unable to remember things, right? So going back to my electric shocks, I'm sort of a fascination for this. No, I'm kidding. But it turns out that the idea was you're asking these guys to memorize stuff, and if they can't remember something, you give them an electric shock. No real electric shock was actually being administered. The question was, how far would people go if a position in authority would say, do it? Turns out nearly everybody administered shocks, increasing the intensity of the shocks, even though the guy was apparently in agony, like screaming in pain, saying, turn it off, I don't want to do it. They would keep giving him shocks. The guy would say, Paul Milgram would say, oh yeah, they have consented to this. Please go through, otherwise the experiments will be ruined. If nowadays, of course, these experiments would not be allowed. It's against human ethics. But in the 1970s, they were doing it a lot. And of course, complexity is too technical. We don't do that stuff because it's related to self-image and conformity. Politeness, I don't want to ask. It avoids the social frictions. So big takeaways today are our brains are biased and, unfortunately, predictable. So these biases feel rational, but they aren't. And they shape how we invest, and they shape how we get exploited. So next time, and the last time, I'm going to talk about how we try to outsmart this by using these biases. We know that we can't get rid of these biases. They're part of being human. So how do we use those biases in our favor? How do governments use these biases to either manipulate us or nudge us? We'll talk about those issues next time. So how do we use behavioral tools to design better choices by leaning into the biases rather than trying to stop something which we are not capable of doing anyway? Right? So these are some of the things we'll talk about. Okay? Thank you all very much.